October 24, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Commander David McCampbell pushed his throttle forward and climbed toward a wall of Japanese aircraft. 60 enemy planes, bombers and fighters mixed together heading for the American fleet. David McCampbell had 7 Hellcats behind him. 8 American fighters against 60 Japanese. The odds were absurd, suicidal, the kind of numbers that ended careers and filled graveyards. But David McCampbell wasn't worried. He was flying the aircraft that Japanese pilots called the Fat American, the Clumsy Pig, the fighter that was supposed to be too heavy, too slow, and too ugly to compete with the legendary Zero. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had mocked this aircraft. They said it flew like a truck. They said any competent Zero pilot could dance around it. They said Americans were compensating for lack of skill with brute force. McCampbell smiled. 90 minutes later, he landed back on the USS Essex with almost no ammunition remaining. Behind him, 15 Japanese aircraft were falling toward the ocean in flames. 9 of them had his name on them. The fat fighter had just delivered the most devastating single-pilot performance in American naval aviation history. And the pilots who had mocked it weren't laughing anymore. They were dead. To understand why the Hellcat mattered, you need to understand what American pilots faced in 1942. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the greatest fighter aircraft in the Pacific, possibly the greatest fighter in the world at that moment. It was light, barely 5,000 pounds fully loaded. It could climb faster than anything the Americans had. It could turn tighter. It could fly farther. Japanese pilots had trained for years in these machines, developing tactics that exploited every advantage. When Zero pilots engaged American fighters in the early months of the war, the results were massacres. At Pearl Harbor, Zeros shot down or destroyed hundreds of American aircraft without losing a single plane to air combat. Over the Philippines, American P-40 pilots fought desperately and died in droves. At Midway, Zeros dominated the skies even as their carriers burned below them. The American fighter that bore the brunt of this slaughter was the F-4F Wildcat. It was a good plane, tough, reliable, decent firepower. But against the Zero, good meant dead. The Wildcat was slower. It couldn't climb as fast, it couldn't turn as tight. In a one-on-one dogfight, the Zero won almost every time. American pilots survived only by refusing to dogfight. They developed desperate tactics, the thatch weave, where 2 Wildcats protected each other by weaving back and forth, each one covering the other's blind spots. It worked, barely, but it was a defensive strategy. It kept pilots alive, but it didn't win air superiority. The Navy needed something better. They needed a fighter that could actually beat the Zero. The problem was how. Grumman Aircraft received the Navy's request for a new fighter in 1942. The engineers studied the Zero carefully. They examined captured aircraft. They interviewed pilots who had survived encounters. They analyzed every strength and weakness. The conventional wisdom said, build a lighter, more agile fighter. Match the Zero's maneuverability, outturn the enemy. Grumman's engineers rejected this completely. They understood something that conventional wisdom missed. The Zero's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness. The Zero was light because it had no armor. A single bullet in the right place would kill the pilot or ignite the fuel tanks. Japanese designers had sacrificed protection for performance. The Zero was agile because it was fragile. Its airframe couldn't handle high-speed dives. If an American pilot dove away at full throttle, the Zero couldn't follow without risking structural failure. The Zero had incredible range because it carried huge fuel tanks with no self-sealing capability. One incendiary round, and the whole aircraft became a fireball. Grumman's solution was radical. Instead of trying to match the Zero, they would build its opposite. They would build a fighter that was heavy, armored, and powerful. A fighter that could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. A fighter that could dive away from any engagement and return to fight on its own terms. They called it the F-6F Hellcat. It was not a pretty aircraft. Where the Zero was sleek and elegant, the Hellcat was bulky and brutal. It weighed over 15,000 pounds fully loaded, 3 times the Zero's weight. It had a massive 2,000 horsepower engine that gave it the power to haul all that extra mass. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plating. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The wings could take hits that would shear off a Zero's wing entirely. When Navy pilots first saw it, they had the same reaction the Japanese would later have. That thing is fat. It looks like a flying beer barrel. How is that supposed to catch a Zero? The answer was simple. It wasn't supposed to catch the Zero. It was supposed to make the Zero come to it. Here's what nobody understood about air combat in 1943. Dogfighting, the swirling, turning battles that everyone imagined, was actually rare. Most kills happened in the first pass. The pilot who saw the enemy first positioned himself correctly and made an accurate attack almost always won. The Zero was designed for extended dogfights. The Hellcat was designed to end fights before they started. One approach belonged to the past. The other belonged to the future. The first Hellcats reached combat squadrons in early 1943. The pilots who transitioned from Wildcats couldn't believe the difference. The Hellcat was faster, 380 miles per hour versus the Wildcat's 320. It climbed better, it dove like a meteor, and the firepower was devastating. 650 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing with 400 rounds per gun. When a Hellcat opened fire, it unleashed a storm of metal that could shred an aircraft in seconds. But the real revelation was survivability. Pilots came back from missions with damage that would have killed them in any other aircraft. Holes in the wings, holes in the fuselage, engine cowlings torn away, oil streaming from punctured lines. The Hellcat kept flying. One pilot returned with over 200 bullet holes in his aircraft. The armor behind his seat had stopped 3 rounds that would have killed him instantly. The self-sealing fuel tanks had closed around a dozen punctures. He landed, switched to a new aircraft, and flew another mission the same day. The Japanese noticed the change immediately. Zero pilots who had dominated the Wildcat found themselves facing a different kind of enemy. The old tactics stopped working. When they tried to turn fight, the Hellcat didn't follow. It dove away, built up speed, and came back with altitude advantage. When they tried to climb above the Americans, the Hellcat's superior power kept pace. When they scored hits, the Hellcat absorbed them and kept coming. And when the Hellcat's guns found their target, the Zero, with its paper-thin skin and unprotected fuel tanks, exploded. The kill ratios began to shift. In 1942, American fighters were losing nearly as many aircraft as they destroyed. By late 1943, Hellcat squadrons were achieving kill ratios of 5-1, 6-1, 10-1. The Zero was no longer the king of the Pacific sky. David McCampbell was not supposed to be a fighter pilot. He was 30 years old when the war started, ancient by fighter pilot standards. He'd been a naval aviator for years but had spent most of his career in non-combat roles. When younger pilots were learning aerobatics, McCampbell was pushing papers. But the Navy needed experienced leaders, and McCampbell had the skills. He was assigned to command Air Group 15 flying off the carrier USS Essex. His first impression of the Hellcat was the same as everyone else's. It's big, it's heavy, it doesn't look like a fighter. Then he flew it. The power was intoxicating. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced more thrust than anything McCampbell had ever experienced. The aircraft accelerated like it was angry. It climbed like it was trying to escape gravity entirely. And when he tested the guns, the 650 calibers roared with a sound that shook his entire body. This wasn't a nimble dancer like the Zero. This was a predator. David McCampbell developed tactics that exploited the Hellcat's strengths ruthlessly. He never turned with Zeros, ever. He used the Hellcat's superior speed and dive performance to control every engagement. He attacked from above, made one devastating pass, and extended away before the enemy could react. If a Zero tried to follow his dive, it would either fall apart from the stress or lose so much speed in the pullout that McCampbell could reverse and attack again. It was systematic, clinical, brutal. By October 1944, McCampbell had already shot down dozens of Japanese aircraft. He was the leading Navy ace in the Pacific, but his greatest day was still coming. October 24, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Navy was making its final desperate gamble, a massive naval offensive to destroy the American landing forces in the Philippines. Every remaining carrier, battleship, and cruiser was committed. American reconnaissance spotted a massive formation of Japanese aircraft heading for the fleet. 60 planes, bombers escorted by Zeros, closing fast. The Essex launched everything it had. David McCampbell led the intercept with 7 other Hellcats, just 8 fighters against 60 enemy aircraft. Standard doctrine said to focus on the bombers. Bombers were the threat to the fleet. Fighters were secondary. David McCampbell ignored doctrine. He understood that if he let the Zero escorts engage freely, they would pick off his Hellcats one by one. He had to break the fighter screen first. He climbed above the formation, positioning the sun behind him. Classic ambush setup. Then he rolled into his attack. His first pass caught the Japanese completely off guard. His guns hammered into a Zero that never saw him coming. The aircraft exploded in midair. He didn't wait to confirm the kill. He was already diving past, building speed, extending away from the formation. Then he pulled up, reversed, and dove again. Second Zero. Same result. The Japanese formation was breaking apart now. Bombers were scattering. Zeros were turning to engage the American fighters. Chaos was spreading through their ranks. McCampbell climbed again, dove again, fired again. 3, 4, 5. His wingman, Roy Rushing, was racking up kills beside him. The 2 Hellcats worked as a team, one attacking while the other covered, then switching. The engagement stretched across 50 miles of ocean. David McCampbell chased damaged aircraft. He pounced on isolated Zeros. He made pass after pass until his guns were almost dry. When he finally turned for home, he had fired almost every round in his aircraft. Behind him, 9 Japanese planes were confirmed destroyed by his guns alone. Rushing had added 6 more. 15 kills, 2 pilots, 8 aircraft. The bombers never reached the fleet. David McCampbell landed on the Essex with so little fuel remaining that his engine sputtered and died as he taxied to a stop. The deck crew counted the remaining ammunition, 2 rounds per gun. He had used everything, every bullet except 12. The intelligence officers debriefed him for hours. Gun camera footage was analyzed frame by frame. The kills were confirmed. 9 enemy aircraft in a single mission. It was the greatest single-day performance by an American fighter pilot in history, a record that still stands today. McCampbell would finish the war with 34 confirmed victories, the highest score of any American Navy ace. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions that October day. But David McCampbell's story was just the most dramatic example of a larger truth. The Hellcat dominated the Pacific sky unlike any fighter before or since. By the end of the war, F-6F Hellcats had shot down 5,223 enemy aircraft, more than any other American fighter type. The kill ratio was staggering. 19 Japanese planes destroyed for every Hellcat lost in combat. The fat fighter that Japanese pilots had mocked became the instrument of their annihilation. The lesson of the Hellcat was counterintuitive but undeniable. The Zero represented one philosophy of fighter design: sacrifice everything for performance. Make the aircraft as light, as fast, as agile as possible. Trust the pilot to avoid getting hit. The Hellcat represented the opposite philosophy. Build the aircraft to survive. Accept the weight penalty of armor and self-sealing tanks. Give the pilot a machine that can take punishment and keep fighting. In 1942, the Zero philosophy seemed superior. By 1944, it was a death sentence. The Japanese couldn't adapt. Their industrial base couldn't produce aircraft fast enough. Their training programs couldn't replace the experienced pilots being slaughtered by Hellcats. And every advantage the Zero once held, its climb rate, its turn radius, its range, meant nothing when Hellcat pilots refused to fight on those terms. The Americans had found the Zero's weakness, and they had built the perfect weapon to exploit it. Today, the Hellcat's philosophy dominates military aviation. Modern fighters are designed around survivability, armor, redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks. The lesson learned in 1943 still applies in 2024. The fat fighter wasn't a compromise. It was the future of air combat. Japanese pilots mocked the Hellcat. They called it slow, clumsy, overweight. They said it couldn't match the Zero's grace. They were right about all of those things, and they died by the thousands because none of those things mattered. The Zero was built to win dogfights. The Hellcat was built to win wars. David McCampbell understood the difference. When he pushed his throttle forward and climbed towards 60 enemy aircraft, he wasn't worried about being outturned. He was thinking about the armor behind his seat, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the massive engine that could pull him out of any situation. He was thinking about the 6 guns that could shred any aircraft in seconds. He was thinking, these men have no idea what's coming. And he was right. Sometimes the ugliest weapon is the deadliest. Sometimes the heaviest fighter wins. And sometimes the men who mock you are just telling you how they're going to die. If this story of counterintuitive design and devastating dominance gripped you, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel uncovers the forgotten stories of World War II, the weapons, tactics, and warriors that actually changed history. Tap the bell so you never miss an upload, and drop a comment below. I want to know. Would you rather fly the nimble Zero or the heavily armored Hellcat? Share this video with anyone who thinks they know everything about aviation. And check out the video on screen right now for another story of underestimated weapons that shocked the world. I'll see you in the next one.